Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to this parallel session this afternoon at the EGP Congress on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on democracy and freedoms. I'm Jean Lambert. I'm a member of the European Green Party's committee, and so I'm chairing for the next hour. But before we start on the session itself, like so often with these things now, we're going to start with a couple of technical announcements, and I'm going to hand over to Greg from the EGP staff, who's going to take you through some of their technicalities for this afternoon, if that's okay. So Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Jean. So you see now on the screen the little menu items that you can interact with during this session. We will keep the audience muted so that there's no echo, there's no any problems with the sound. You can talk among each other with this little chat bubble that you see here. I will write in that chat now so you can see where you can interact with each other. But I would like to remind you that we will not follow this chat. So if you want to ask questions from the speakers, from our panelists, then please use the other option, which is a little speech bubble with a question mark in it called questions and answers. And when you ask a question, please also state your name and organization, and also preferably country, so that we can maintain a regional balance when it comes to the questions. And the session will take an hour.
Okay, so that's the technical part over. And now we're on to the political part, the part that everybody has come for. And we've got three really great speakers this afternoon to share their thoughts with us about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on democracy and freedoms. We've seen during the pandemic so far the way in which some governments have been really open, transparent, have worked with their public to keep them informed, to keep things moving. We've had other governments that maybe have been a bit more hit and miss on that. And then we've seen others who you get the feeling have looked at this and thought, oh, here's a golden opportunity. We're looking at lockdown, we're looking at all sorts of measures we can take to basically keep people in their homes, keep people quiet. And then there's the concern about, well, are those governments actually going to open up and behave any differently afterwards? And how should we, as people who are politically active, be reacting to this? What should we be looking for? What should be our response? So that when we're talking about building back better, this isn't just in terms of the economy, it's not only in terms of the climate crisis, but it's also about how do we work to make sure that our democracy at least hasn't gone backwards and indeed possibly has learnt some lessons. So we're going to take our three speakers in order. They're going to do, present as they wish, and then we'll come to the questions and answer session afterwards. So I'm delighted that we're starting this afternoon with Ivan Krastev, who, amongst many other things, and you can see the full biographies that we've been given on the Congress Council's sort of general website. I'm not going through it all here, but amongst the many things that he's engaged with, he's currently a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. He's also quite a prolific author and indeed has a new book out later this month entitled "Is It Tomorrow Yet? How the Pandemic Changes Europe." So you can see why we've invited Ivan to come and talk to us with his ideas about how the pandemic is changing Europe. So we wanted him to answer a question about, are European democracies equipped for managing a crisis like the one we're seeing now? And what do the responses that we've seen mean for the health long term of our democracies? So Ivan, if we can have your camera or at least your voice, we'd be delighted if you can speak to us for the next few minutes. Thank you. We're not hearing anything. So does that mean we've lost a connection, Greg?
Probably. I will check with him, and if you don't mind, then we can move on to the next speaker meanwhile.
Okay, so while we're trying to sort that out, this is one of the delights about doing this online. Let's move then to Hannah Neumann, who's a member of the European Parliament at the moment, and is a vice chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee in the European Parliament and a member of its Foreign Affairs Committee, and is also the Peace and Human Rights Coordinator for the Green EFA group in the Parliament. And so, Hannah, we were wondering whether you think that the global COVID-19 pandemic is being used as an alibi for human rights abuses. And are there particular cases that you think might illustrate this? And if so, what are the responses that we need to give? And indeed, what can we be doing as Europe as a whole, the European Union in particular? So Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, Jean. And I hope you can all hear me. If you can hear me, just, okay, that's perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction. And I think your questions went right to the point. But I would like to also give a better understanding of the global situation, maybe start at the beginning of the pandemic and the human rights situation globally then, because we had within Europe, so it all started in China, and in China we already saw some limitations of human rights that were needed to combat the pandemic. So, for example, to restrict the freedom of movement to some degree, to restrict the freedom of assembly to some degree. This is something that goes initially against human rights, but the pandemic made this necessary. But already in China, we saw a regime that was, let's say, overstepping of what was necessary. So, for example, the first doctors that reported on the pandemic, the first doctors that provided pictures about the situation in the hospitals, usually they disappeared a few days later, and of many of them we have not heard until today. And I think this whole situation at the moment also for us as politicians in how we assess the situation is very tricky, because we have these very much needed limitations to human rights to combat the pandemic that are challenged in our own European societies, that are challenged in many countries around the globe. And we have these limitations that I think and many others think are not justifiable, like people disappearing who just use their freedom of expression. And it's quite a tight line that we have to walk at the moment when we assess the situation and when we criticize countries, because there are some countries we criticize for not doing enough in terms of restricting the human rights to combat the pandemic. And there are other countries that we criticize because we think they are overdoing it. And it's not that we have had this situation already and that we would have this very clear guideline of what is okay and what is not okay. And that is what we're kind of trying to develop at the moment in a joint exchange in the European Parliament, but also globally. But if we look at the situation globally, and I think others in this panel will speak about the European situation, we especially have to keep in mind that the problems that our rather stable, rather rich, rather democratic societies have been facing with this pandemic were enormous. But if we look at other countries, especially crisis-ridden countries, countries that have been impoverished before, countries that had a weak health system before, they are facing the problems times 10. And we don't have this kind of one-size-fits-all solutions. So whereas in many European countries, it was possible to have some kind of lockdown. So at least people would not go to work and would just go shopping for the most important stuff. That didn't work, for example, in countries like the Philippines, where people could decide to either break the rule of the lockdown and therefore put their life in danger, because a dictator like Duterte said, well, we're just going to shoot on everybody who breaks the lockdown. Or they could stay at home, but then they wouldn't just have enough food. And if you live from your daily, basically from your daily labor, it's impossible for you to stay at home for 2 or 3 months. And that's also why the criteria that we put on these situations inside Europe may not be working in these other situations in countries. So what we see, and we continue to see it now that the pandemic also spreads over Africa, is we see weak health systems, we see impoverished population, we see often many people living in an overcrowded place. So you usually have extended families of something between 10 and 50 people living in 5, 6, 7, 8 houses. And it's like 10 people in one room. And so all these measures that we think are necessary are impossible to implement. And we had also in the initial stage the very difficult situation of migrant workers. I don't know who of you remembers the pictures in India where the Indian government actually tried to do something very good. They said, well, dear migrant workers, can you please go home so that we don't have these many people and these people going back and forth. But they announced it in a way that there was a total panic and at the same time shut down the transportation infrastructure. So people were basically stuck without work, all overcrowded in one place, no clue where to go, having no money. And then the government had to adjust and find other ways. We had the same on the Arabian Peninsula, where we know we have many migrant workers from Pakistan and other countries who all of a sudden, well, were kind of unwanted in their host families, especially the domestic workers, but also couldn't go back because the borders were locked. So we put many people in very difficult situation, sometimes even unintentionally. So it was not that regimes compromised on their human rights because they were very nasty, but they just compromised on their human rights because we didn't have governance of this pandemic and how to do it. So that are the kind of nice human rights problems, that it's not people just deliberately clamping down on human rights because they use the pandemic as a pretext. The latter we sadly have as well. And that actually is the ones that concern me more, because it's not just that you find a solution or a better approach or a nicer mechanism to deal with it in the future. What we have been looking at especially is whether when there are restrictions to human rights because to fight the health crisis, whether they are proportionate. That is one criteria we look at, and whether they are time-bound or time-limited. So whether they are either they need to be renewed after a certain time, like 1 month or 2 months, or whether they are directly linked to certain numbers or cases decreasing or something. And that is sadly in many countries we don't see that. And just to allude some of the problems that have been resulting of that, we have seen in many countries that prisoners had actually been released because the prisons are overcrowded, and that was a very bad spreading ground basically for the virus. But we have seen in many countries that the criminal prisoners were released, but not the political prisoners. And their situation was even further worsened because of the pandemic, because trials, I mean, most of them have not been sentenced, but they have just been in prison until their trial is finished, but trials were continuously postponed and are until today. They were no longer allowed to see their families. They couldn't even call their families. So all these kind of check mechanisms that we would have in the human rights scene to see how they are doing, to see whether they are still alive, how their health is, it all kind of disappeared. We also see many measures being taken that have had racist connotations. So, for example, water supply was reduced for one ethnic group, basically, and not for the others. The same with the releasing of the political prisoners. We have seen a clampdown on freedom of expression, where I think it's unacceptable because that has nothing to do with the health situation. If people post stuff on Twitter, that doesn't put anyone in a health risk. And we have seen that across the globe. We also now see the app, and that is why I think it is so important that this tracing and tracking app that we develop in the European Union, or in the different ones that we develop in the different member states, is absolutely top-notch on data protection, because we see in many other countries that they start to misuse the app to just basically track and trace their whole citizens, where they are going, what they are doing, whom they are meeting with. And I just don't want them to use us as a justification for doing this in their own country. So that's why I think it's also very important that we are super careful about that. Then, of course, we see the violence, and I found it very interesting to see that some of the countries that have requested for debt relief and that have been given that relief now had to come up with their plan of how they would spend the money to combat the health crisis. And some of them have attributed between 20 and 30% of that money to buying weapons. and strengthening their military and police to enforce lockdowns. And that is why I think we also need to be super careful in seeing how the pandemic is used as a pretext to make sure the police is well equipped, for example, which, well, they don't give away the weapons later on. And that would just be a side note before I go to the question of what do we do now, because it's global relevant and it also has an impact on human rights. How do we distribute vaccine and medicine once it's available? Because when we have the vaccines, when we have medicine, there will never be enough for everybody in the first place. And the question is who gets it? And Trump pulling out from WHO, the ones who should do the governance already, I think, gives us quite a good idea of what will happen. The same struggle that we have over the protective equipment, so like the masks and the ventilators, I think we will see it even worse around the vaccines, and we should better get prepared soon. So what do we do now? I think at the moment it is super important that we just carefully watch the developments and that we clearly denounce whenever we think a regime is overstepping or a certain measure is not proportionate. I think we should, and I'm pushing the Commission, and I'm pretty confident that we will have that after summer, monitor the situation in all countries. So monitor what restrictions on human rights had been put in place because of COVID, and to then monitor which ones are taken back and which ones are not, and then really request why this is the case and push for them to be taken back as the pandemic ceases. To also monitor the human rights violations that have been committed during the pandemic that could not be followed up upon in the way we would usually do it because we cannot travel, because court cases don't take place, etc. To just make sure they are not forgotten and that we can combat the impunity, question them, put them into the systems that we would put them into otherwise as well. And I think, and I quickly explained that already with the case of the app, we should lead by example. Because we have had restrictions to human rights, also to parliamentary democracy, giving so much executive powers to governments within Europe at the beginning of the pandemic, that I think now we should lead by example to show how we can go back to regular democracy, that it's possible, and that it needs to be done, so that it gives us much more credibility when we request the same from countries like Brazil, where the situation is a disaster at the moment, countries like the Philippines. And as I said, I'm still a bit worried to see what will happen on the African continent, as now we see increasing numbers of cases there as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Hannah. You've raised a lot of important points there, and I think that the question about the leading by example is is going to be a crucial one for us. So I'd like to move on now to Ivan. Sorry, we lost you earlier there. And I mean, in a sense, Hannah has also done an introduction there. Are we handling things so much better? Do we have room to be proud, complacent, or are there risks here as well? So can I hand over to you, Ivan?
Thank you very much. I missed the first 10 minutes and I hope I'm not going to repeat something that have been already said. But for me, there's three things that are critically important. One is to try to see this situation as a new one. For example, many of the restrictions that have been put in the last 2 months very much reminds us of what happened during the War on Terror. You have basically strong executive, you have surveillance and so on. But we should be also very careful because society does not basically experience them in the same way. For example, public support for surveillance based on the public health issues is much higher, including this kind of a virus tracking apps, for simple reasons that people are very much afraid that they unconsciously can become the reason for the suffering of somebody else. And from this point of view, it's quite important, basically, much more to be sure that we are going to give the frame in which this surveillance makes sense and where basically the abuse can go and how this is going to be used, particularly if we're going to see the crisis not finishing in a short time. The second thing that I do believe was a common sense, and I'm not sure that I'm totally in agreement with this, was that the authoritarian leaders, and particularly authoritarian leaders in a country that you have certain type of elections, are going to be the major beneficiary of this crisis. This is my feeling that basically, of course, the authoritarian leaders like crisis, but mostly crisis that they create themselves. Because the biggest kind of a freedom for any dictator is to choose the crisis to which it responds. The problem with the COVID-19 is that you cannot shift to another crisis. And from this point of view, it's not by accident that Bolsonaro or President Trump or Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus are unhappy with this crisis. And here comes my major argument. What happened during the crisis was that suddenly we have been living in a common political space. And people can compare what others are doing in the neighboring countries. You're staying home, and because now all the talk was about COVID-19, you know the policies of the other government, you know basically how many people have been infected, how many people have died, when you're opening or when you're closing, and this puts a huge pressure on government. So from this point of view, the state of exception and the state of emergency is one game when it is basically introduced in a single country, totally different when it is on the continental or global scale. This is why, for example, it's not going to be easy for anybody, particularly in Europe, to try to prolong the state of emergency when all others are lifting it. And for me, this is really critically important, there are two things that we should be very careful about. One is, during the lockdown, you said you're sending non-essential institutions to go home. And one of these non-essential institutions happened to be parliaments. Keeping in mind that parliaments basically have lost a lot of support among the population. How to try to legitimize the central role of parliaments in this situation is critically important, because I agree very much with Hannah. This shift to a much more empowered executive, which didn't start with this crisis, have been very much moving in this direction. And the second story is that now people start talking very much about digitalization, the possibility to vote by post. And I do believe that there is this tendency that you can have a democracy in a totally digital political space. I could be very old-fashioned on this, but I do believe democracy is much more physical than this. People should meet, they should talk. And one of the most important things is, particularly in a moment where many citizens are not sure anymore, do they live in a democratic or non-democratic countries? Being on the street and how you're treated there is of critical importance. So from this point of view, one of the major risks is, if we're going to go with a second or third wave, if the social distancing is going to stay for a long time, empty streets and empty squares are going to put very much under questions the very understanding of people about the nature of the regime in which they're living. I don't believe it was accidental that the moment when you basically have the lockdown over, the first things that people basically did in many countries is just went on the street to protest. Because keeping your presence on the street appeared to be very important. And from this point of view, how to try to use this type of a political activism at the same time being aware that some of these demonstrations can lead to the spread of the virus, and how basically to balance it. For me, this is a major issue. Now, because one of the other side of total empowerment of the executive is the empowerment of the street as a kind of a constraint to power. So this is basically the situation I see it, and also it's different from country to country, and this is quite important when we're trying to see what is going on and what is not going on, even within Europe itself, to try basically not to generalize, because in some countries this type of a state of emergency are going to have a long tails, in other they are not going to have a long tails, and basically people are going to be much more pushing their governments to find the limits of their newly found power. And I want to basically end up on something positive. Because COVID-19 is known to affect particularly negative patients with a pre-existing conditions, and because the democracy in Europe very much was such a patient, there was major kind of a mistrust in institutions. There was basically disappointment. I do believe that at the end of the day, at least on the basis of the data that I saw in opinion polling in different countries, there is no public kind of demand for authoritarianism coming as a result of this crisis. People have their questions. It's very different, as I said, from country to country. But to talk about the effect of COVID-19, of making people demanding a strong hand and so on, at least I don't see this at all in the data.
Thank you very much. I think you've given us a lot to think about there. I'm linked with the Global Greens on behalf of the European Green Party. And when we were having quite a discussion with representatives of the other federations, it was a representative from Africa who was talking about, look, for us and elections, this is difficult because for us, elections are very physical. You know, we're out there, we don't know how we're going to campaign now that we can't be physical anymore. And I think, that the point that you're raising about that being sort of physically present and the challenges that, that we're going to have in balancing that, I think is something we should really be thinking about, not least because we're a political movement. I wanted to move now to Benedek Gával from Hungary, who, I've known for some time, from when he was a member of the Hungarian Parliament and then as a member of the European Parliament. But now Benedek has a role as with the representation of the city of Budapest in Brussels. And obviously, there are a lot of concerns about Hungary. There have been on what's been happening there. And raised a bit more as well during the pandemic. So Benedek, do you want to share something of your experiences there with us for a few minutes? Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you for the contribution of Ivan and Hannah. My approach might be a little bit different, and let's look at Hungary as a case study. So I would try to explain what is happening in Hungary from a very practical perspective. That is the perspective of the city of Budapest. So it's a municipality, and how the room for maneuver of an opposition municipality, or in general the opposition municipalities, can be made extremely difficult by the government with reference to the COVID-19 crisis. And to understand this, let's go back in time a little bit before the COVID-19 outbreak in February in Europe. And that's important because the situation of the local level, the municipality level in Hungary is extremely important, as at the last elections in October 2019, the opposition won almost half of the bigger cities in Hungary, and that was the first major loss of Fidesz, the governing party, since 2010, and also what was perhaps the most painful for the government, that they lost the capital city of Budapest. Of course, the government started to find some explanations for those losses. Partly they tried to explain that there is no loss at all, they've won everything, and in the governmental media, a complete alternative reality was broadcasted. Also, they found the reasons or the arguments like foreign citizens voting at the local elections, European citizens voting at the local elections in Budapest. They were 50,000 or 60,000 or even more, or 90,000. They decided the elections. But finally, they had to realize that they lost many municipalities in Hungary. And it's important because when it comes to illiberal democracies in and outside Europe, I think that when we are talking about how to counteract illiberal tendencies in those countries, the municipal level, the local level has an extreme importance, and perhaps that's the level where we can start to get back our countries from illiberal autocratic regimes. And that's something the Fidesz knows very well. But for a while, they really didn't find the way how to fight against those local governments and municipalities, as to open a war against municipalities and their citizens could have fired back. It's not very popular to punish your own citizens, so it was quite risky for the government to openly launch a war against the municipalities and local governments. And for a while, they really didn't find the way how they should act and how they should manage this situation. On the surface, for a long time, they were talking about cooperation with the municipalities, regardless their political color, and what is important is the development of the municipalities. But already at that time, and this was until January, at that time, from governmental sources, we heard that there is a very intensive brainstorming to find out that how they could still kill the local governments and municipalities without really opening a war against the citizens. There were some attempts from the government, even in February and March, to destroy competencies of the local government, but finally most of them were withdrawn. And this, a little bit, perhaps, the government was a little bit lost, and this changed very quickly once the COVID-19 pandemic outbroke in Hungary in mid-March. And as Jean, you mentioned in your introduction, very soon we had to realize that the government looks at the COVID-19 as the golden opportunity to do something they wanted to do, but they were not able to do without losing millions and millions of Hungarian citizens' support, and to use the coronavirus pandemic as a cover story to execute a political action. And very soon we had to face with the infamous Enabling Act, which was of course not without examples, as most of the national governments wanted special competencies to be effective in the fight against coronavirus. But the Hungarian Enabling Act went beyond the normal frameworks of those proposals. First, it was unlimited without any time limitation, so it was completely put in the hands of the government when they decide to withdraw the application of the Enabling Act. Secondly, there were some measures which were not necessarily normal, including regulations threatening journalists and punishing and criminalizing spreading so-called fake news. Up to now, there were 2 cases when this part of the Enabling Act was applied. Both of them was because of 2 Facebook posts of citizens. The Facebook posts were absolutely not fake news or were not any threatening posts. They just communicated some basic facts, what is happening on the local level in Hungary. So the Enabling Act itself, it went beyond the normal special entitlement of governments in the COVID crisis. And what was important, that it made possible for the government to rule the country by decrees. And very soon we had to realize that what those decrees are really used for, and it's not making the fight against coronavirus more effective in the country, but much more, and that's what the COVID-19 crisis was used by the Hungarian government to cut the financial background of the local governments and municipalities. There is a long list of governmental decisions. Already in Hungary, the system is quite centralized, and very few of the locally generated tax incomes are really managed by the local governments. 95–97% of the tax incomes goes to the central budget. Still, there are some local tax incomes which constitute the most important incomes for the cities, including the city of Budapest. And the government systematically started to cut the tax incomes of the cities with reference to the COVID crisis, saying that they need the money to cover the cost of the defense against the coronavirus pandemic. And while in fact most of the real actions were done by the local governments. And for example, the city started in Hungary, Budapest, for example, to distribute masks for the citizens, and a lot of additional measures were applied by the city. Still, the money was taken away, like centralizing the vehicle tax, which is an important income for the districts and the city, to make parking free in the city, which I don't see what is really the link with the COVID crisis. But again, that was important from the perspective of just closing some channels of generated incomes for the municipalities. And they started to also to limit the local business tax, which is the most important income factor for the city. 70% of Budapest incomes are coming from the local business tax. And first they made a test phases with a smaller city in the countryside, the city of Göd, where they launched the system of special economic zones. And in special economic zones, which could be created by the government anywhere in the country, in the special economic zones, all the local business tax incomes are not going to the local government, to the municipality, but go to the county level municipality or the county level self-governance, which we have 19 counties in Hungary and 19 county level self-governance. All of them is controlled by Fidesz. So again, after they introduced the system of special economic zones in the case of a small city in the countryside not far from Budapest, a few weeks later they tabled in a bill in the parliament which enlarged the system of the special economic zones to the rest of the country. So now on, the government with a decree can create a special economic zone anywhere in the country where there is any investment over 5 billion forints, which is not a big what, it's like 100 million euros. Anywhere where you have an investment over 100 million euros, the government can say that that's a special economic zone from today, and all the tax incomes are taken away from the local governments. There were some additional decisions by the government, for example, the withdrawal of already decided subsidies for local governments, quite significant amount of money, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going too much into the details. This is just to say, as the time is over, I know, Jean, that what the government did during the corona crisis is to carry out a political war, a political campaign against the local governments, which is not it was not executed as a political campaign, but through cutting and destroying the incomes of the local governments. And now we are there. Most of the potential incomes are already taken away for the municipalities. There is a huge centralization. And what is also important, that while originally it was told that this is a temporary decision by the government, but now we see that while they already withdrawn the Enabling Act and there is no special law in Hungary anymore, but those decisions they made under the Enabling Act with decrees, they will survive this period. And already in the national budget of 2021, those cuts in the budget of the local governments will be maintained. And in this situation, it's really important to mention, if just let me to give just one thing, is the role of the EU. Because of course, the recovery plan and the measures and decisions made by the Commission to help the member states to fight against COVID, they were important and right decisions. On the other hand, it also means that there is even more flexibility for the member states in the use of the EU funds, and there is even less control over the management and the use of the EU funds. And this also means that the government is going to use the EU funds as well to allocate or redirect them to municipalities led by Fidesz, and to cut away the opposition municipalities from the EU funds. And the recovery plan money, and again, I'm not going into the details, but we see the plans of the government how to use not only the existing EU financing strength, but also in the post-2020 MFF. We see the plans that basically the opposition municipalities will be killed by the government, partly with the use of EU funding. And while the incomes of the city of Budapest are completely dried out, the government is building up an alternative, a parallel structure, the so-called Budapest Development Center, which is controlled by the government, and all the money will be allocated there. And finally, and that's my conclusion, finally what the government will say, that look at those opposition local governments, opposition-led municipalities, they are unable to manage properly their own cities or villages. They are unable to fight effectively against coronavirus. They are in a complete economic disaster, and that's their fault why all the municipalities and local governments led by the Fidesz, they perform quite well, and this will be done by EU money. So finally, the opposition municipalities in Hungary will be bought for the Fidesz with the European taxpayers' money, with EU funds, and that's really something on the European level we should address, and to convince the decision makers in the Commission and in the Council that it's not only a Hungarian problem, it's not only the problem of the city of Budapest, it's not only the Hungarian municipalities' problem, but it's a European problem. The European taxpayers' money is used to worsen the situation in Hungary and push the country towards even further on this democratic backsliding.
Thank you very much, Bendik. That's a very extensive description of what's happening there, and a real challenge, I think, to us at the end. That maybe to come back to what Ivan was talking about in terms of the underlying conditions, which make systems vulnerable. That if we're looking at sort of the power of the executive certainly being part of the health check, that we ought to be looking at. If we've got a bit of time, not much for the questions, just to remind people, maybe those who joined a bit later, that we're taking the questions in writing through the question and answer facility. We're not monitoring the chat on this one. And we've got one question which has already come through from colleague from the Greens in Finland, Kaisu Tai, who's got a question there about the Schengen area and saying that, you know, the Schengen area has been jeopardized in recent years, first by the pretext of the refugee situation, then by COVID-19, and even in normal times, people of color, Slavic language speakers, and so on have been subject to de facto and disguised border checks. When can we return to normal for Schengen, or even do better than the old normality of the status quo? So who would like to pick up that question from our speakers? Ivan, do you want to have a go?
Yeah.
On Schengen?
Thank you very much. I do believe it's quite important because in a certain way, particularly in the first 2 weeks, when the lockdown started, we saw the geopolitical version of the social distancing. Closing of the borders was incredibly quick. On the other side, I do believe it's quite important to distinguish the nationalism that came with the refugee crisis from the nationalism that came with this crisis. The nationalism of the refugee crisis was totally ethnic. It was about origins. This time it was very much based on residence. I'm going to give you a very simple example. During the refugee crisis, the dream of a majority of the Bulgarians was that all those Bulgarians living abroad should come back and the foreigners should not come. But during this type of a crisis, there was not much enthusiasm for Bulgarians living outside of Bulgaria to come back, because the fear was that they're going to bring with them the infection and they're basically increasing the risk. At the same time, in many countries, the migrants have been treated like being residents because the governments understood that you cannot simply neglect part of the population. This is going to affect the public health of everybody. Secondly, I do believe that with the developing of time, we saw the limits, particularly of economic nationalism, and this is why I'm much more hopeful about Schengen comparing where population stays in. First, you understand that the moment you cannot close yourself in your apartment for the whole of your life and believing that this is the way you're going to deal with COVID-19, I do believe also people understood that you cannot simply close your country forever and this is what you can do. At the moment when people were not allowed to leave their apartments, there was a special charter flights organized for Bulgarians and Romanians to go to Germany and Austria to do the harvest of asparagus, because basically there was nobody to work. So in a certain way, people overnight understood how much European economies are interdependent, to what extent crossing of the borders is a good symbolic politics, but at the end of the day, the moment it happens, nothing works. And I do believe that as a result of it, we can have a new momentum in which, while people get more kind of a loyalty to their national states, there is quite a lot of questions that have been asked about the role of the European Union in the first stage of the crisis. But now I don't believe that Schengen has lost the opportunity to keep the borders open, and particularly for the younger generations. Normally, you start value something at the moment when you're losing it. I will see a lot of people younger than 25 who never knew that, for example, there is border between Austria and the Czech Republic. And they suddenly saw that there could be a border. But, and I do believe it very much goes to what our Hungarian colleague is saying, I do believe that part of the price for getting and stabilizing the single market and keeping the borders open is going to be turning away from certain political developments in countries like Hungary and others, because you obviously need the cooperation of these countries when it comes to the recovery plan, when it comes basically to keeping the borders open. And this is a real risk. There are going to be really real trade-offs, and it's already, you can feel this basically happening in the different countries.
Hannah, I think you wanted to come in. I mean, I'd just like to say something as coming from the UK, of course, you know, yes, you really start to value things when they're going, if you ever use them, I think is the issue there. But Hannah, you wanted to come in on this.
I was actually very fascinated by Ivan's answer that was clearly distinguishing between a, let's say, racial or racist failure of Schengen, falling down of Schengen when we had the refugee crisis, and now very much linked to the health situation. But something still bothered me maybe more than Ivan about this lockdown of the crisis, and that is that as soon as there is something like a crisis feeling, we fall back to this illusion of national answers. And we did that again. So it was that, okay, we need to fix it. We do it as a nation state. We shut down like the borders. We just restrict everything on the nation state, and that's how we can solve it. On the analytical level, it was very helpful to see exactly what Ivan described. It didn't work. There were so many problems where it didn't work and where there was so much frustration. It was the seasonal workers, but we also had like the medical workers. We had the equipment. We had the economy. And I mean, if you looked at how actually it worked with the borders, they were open quite soon, except for those who just wanted to travel. But I'm afraid on the, let's say on the feeling level, we have to work more. And I just saw a poll in Germany from today where people were asked, so that now you can travel again and the borders are open, is that a feeling of joy or a feeling of threat for you? And we still had 52 people saying it's a feeling of threat. So this illusion that you can better solve things on the national level, it has been strengthened again by the way nation states responded in the first place. And I think we have to do a lot of work to combat this and to go back to what we maybe had before the refugee situation even.
Can I make just one point, because I found this critically important, that I saw also data. European Council on Foreign Relations did a survey in 9 EU member states, including Germany. It's still not published, but there is one interesting story. First, what Hannah is saying is totally right. As a result of this crisis, people trust much more their national states than the European Union. At the same time, people were so much shocked what they see outside of Europe, particularly the view on the United States and China has deteriorated, that we can have support for empowering the European Union, but they are not going to be the federalist argument. In a certain way, people are ready to give power to Brussels to the extent that they do believe this is going to keep their national states relevant. And this is particularly true for Germany. And I do believe one of the interesting stories, I have a huge respect for the position of the German finance minister, but on the level of rhetoric, this is not a Hamiltonian moment. But this is a moment in which many people, 70% said, we need more European cooperation, we need much more unified policies because we're totally alone. And how to combine this, how basically try not to allow this situation to backfire, for me is the critical political issue that people like you should solve. Because this crisis did not make people more enthusiastic about the European Union in none of the countries. And particularly people in the countries where the national government did well, Scandinavian countries, Germany, even more than ever believing that their governments works better than Brussels. This could be, by the way, just or unjust. I don't believe that Brussels has much a role to play during the public health part of the crisis, but this is where
they didn't let Brussels play a role, which was part of the problem and the whole mess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, with this, that we're looking at, you know, the role of Brussels within this. Is part of the question maybe that people actually don't necessarily understand what the role of Brussels is. So therefore, Brussels, you know, the European Union is. So therefore, actually had expectations about what it could and could not do, which could not be met.
But to this one,
and we have another question.
I really want to share for me, a very instructive example on this. There is a European agency that basically deals with health and pandemic and exchanging information. And they sent a request in January to all member states saying we had this pandemic outbreak in China. We may see something like this in Europe. Could you please let us know what equipment you have? To what extent you think you have enough on stock or you even have overstocked so that we can organize a plan in case and that we have all the knowledge in case there is an outbreak. And only half of the member states responded, and those that responded said we are all fine. So that's what I mean by the European Union or Brussels or however you call it is trying to play its role but to some extent there's even obstructions from the member states in the first place, which then backfires against Brussels. And I think that is, I'm not saying we did everything, or Brussels or the EU or the Commission did everything perfectly, but I think there's a lot of knowledge and layers of information that are just missing in the public debate, and that lead to this misperception of the role of the EU in this crisis. You're muted, Jean. I think you're mute.
Because I knew at some point I would forget to press the particular button. Okay, the question from Christian Beck from the German Greens, saying that, Ivan, you've been great in explaining the sort of maybe an East-West divide on values that benefits people like Viktor Orban in building up his autocracy. And when the EU now invests for recovery and discusses its development in a conference on the future of Europe, what should we do to strengthen that sense of European citizenship, especially for maybe East Europeans? And then there's a following question for you, Benedek, in a moment.
I do believe that Benedek is much better positioned than me to comment on Hungary, honestly speaking. It's one thing to observe, it's totally different to live in a country. But there is one important thing about the Orban case, because when people are asking why he decided to go with this kind of a unlimited in time state of emergency, keeping in mind that he had a constitutional majority in the parliament. So from this point of view, Hungary is in a state of emergency, even in the absence of COVID-19. One of the things that, in my view, he really fears is the decline of political polarization. Honestly speaking, on COVID-19, one of his major fears was that the opposition in the parliament can decide to support common positions on the pandemic, and then he cannot come with his usual narrative that he are the enemies of the Hungarian people and the allies of the virus. So from this point of view, it's quite important to understand that some of these political leaders, political polarization is not the instrument. This is the ultimate goal. You fear that you can agree on this or that. And this is particularly with the case of Hungary, because I do believe one of the strengths of the new mayor of Budapest was the fact that he's not the one obsessed only about Orban. He really wants to do something. And this is critically important, because I do believe what is going and should happen on the level of the European discussion is to understand that some of these political leaders are weaker than they have been during the refugee crisis, because you cannot keep people totally polarized all the time. Secondly comes the economic part of the crisis, and it's different from Poland and Hungary, but Hungary, corruption is the name of the game. People are seeing this. They're very much seeing who is getting the money, why they're getting the money, what is happening. And I do believe from this point of view, the European Union should try basically not to attack Mr. Orban where he wanted to be attacked on the issues of sovereignty, but much more to try to say, let's see what you're doing for your citizens. Because there is a sensitivity, and I do believe that you can see this also in other places. Part of the things that I didn't touch on, but which is really important, is that because of all this crisis, because of the fact that you don't have a normal democratic process, we can end up in many places with contested elections. Parties who are losing the elections, not going to recognize them. To be honest, the United States can be one. And this is an issue, and this is kind of a major issue, because in a highly polarized society, contested elections basically is going totally to destroy the legitimacy of the democratic process. And how to kind of think about this before this has happened is going to be critically important. I do believe that the success of Poland not to have the elections in the way Mr. Kaczynski have been planning in the middle of the pandemic also shows that there are certain constraints, both domestic and international, that can be used.
That I think your comparisons there with Poland are interesting, and the next question that we have is aimed, I think, particularly at you, Benedikt, in connection with Poland. That from Eva Sufin Jacmar of the Polish Green Foundation, Strefa Zeleni, and she's asking, in Poland, the PS government has the same strategy as you've been discussing. How can the opposition implement the European Green Deal in cities with such a budgetary war going on? Do you hope that the European Union policy to protect democracy and the rule of law will help?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, and just if I may make 3 short remarks as the time is already over. The first is just to refer back the discussion of how the EU performed in the COVID crisis. And I must say, while I'm very critical towards European institutions in some cases, I'm rather optimistic on that, as simply the construction of the EU looks like that all the health competencies belong to the member states. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I saw a lot of communication saying that, look, the EU is not able to do anything against the crisis, and that's again the member states, the nation states, which can solve the problem for their citizens. And this could be ended up in a situation where Eurosceptic talks and political forces are coming up again in Europe. And finally, it's not the case. And as Ivan was already mentioned, that instead of that, the talks are much more about to improve the construction of the European building, and to talk about if we need to give stronger competencies, for example, on the area of healthcare, as we see that this is an all-European issue and it's not possible to solve it effectively on the member state level. So I think that here we came out from a very, and I don't know if everyone is aware of that, from a very dangerous situation. We came out from that relatively well, I believe. Secondly, just a short answer, because Ivan, again, you mentioned that when the enabling act, the opposition voted against it.
Sorry, have we lost?
Yeah, I believe we lost
Benedek,
I think so. He's frozen also. So.
Yeah, it looks. We haven't deliberately frozen him out. I think he's just frozen there. So maybe he'll rejoin in a moment. He says we're over time. We can run a few minutes, and of course, we don't know. Even though the session coming up at 4:30, is super interesting. But can we maybe then just take the last question here very quickly? Maybe, I don't know, Hannah, if you want to have a go at this, from Charles Berkow of the Swedish Greens, about how can EU funds be used to strengthen rather than weaken democratic member states? If we've got this example coming,
Well, this debate is not a new one. It's a debate that we also already had before the corona pandemic. How can we use these funds? And there's, for me, 2 steps. The one is, how can we use these funds to strengthen citizen participation, to strengthen civil society organization, to strengthen local governance structures, especially on the community level. And the second one is, how can we make sure that the money we are spending is not misused by others like Orban, but we see it also in other EU member states. It's not misused to basically for them to uphold power, to feed into corruption networks, to misuse the funds to just give it to whoever is nice with them and supports them politically. And this is the 2 strands that we have been discussing in the first place, and I think we need to discuss them with more sincerity and more insistence now that the money is getting more and the democratic situation is getting worse. And one thing for sure, and we Greens have been advocating for this forever, and we're still making this a conditionality for the new budget, is a rule of law mechanism that basically says, well, if you misuse that money, you will be punished and you will not get it anymore. The problem is that as these funds are not just going to a government, but are used for social development, are used for civil society. If we say no money is going to Hungary, we are punishing the critical civil society that we want to strengthen as much as we're punishing Orban. So that is why it's not an easy one-size-fits-all approach. And I think the European prosecutor who is looking into transparency issues and who's looking into misuse of funds is a good start, and we need to strengthen him. We need to be very careful about how we use the sanctioning mechanism that we want to have, we as Greens. And I think we need to make sure that there are at some point funds that are not just channeled through the national governments, but that go directly to civil society. There are approaches towards this end. And I think the last one, that's also something a colleague of mine, Sergej Lagodinsky, is pushing very hard, is that we will have the possibility for, the German word is Vereine, so for local associations to not just register on national level, but to be able to register as EU associations, so that they cannot be forbidden and taken out of financial streams and that kind of stuff from their national governments. So also to say, but we as the European Union support them, and it's not just going through Hungary or Poland or others. So it's not an easy one-size-fits-all approach, but we are, I think, seeing with the new budget to what extent we can push, especially EPP, but also ECR, to support some of these mechanisms. And just in the Parliament resolution on the COVID, it was very interesting because we needed EPP support in the end to get it pushed through. And we knew if we put rule of law conditionality in it, we're not going to get it. So the language now says the spending of the funds needs to be in accordance with the values enshrined in the treaties of the European Union. These are the weird steps and tricks that we are taking, but I think in general there is a majority understanding in the Parliament, but it gets difficult in the Council when Hungary and Poland themselves basically will have to vote on sanctioning themselves.
Yes, that's always the problem, isn't it? When the very people that you're asking for support from the people that you also want to get at. I think we should really be drawing to a close.
Sorry, but I had some connection problems. I'm back. Just a last remark, and I forget all the others, because I think it's important to answer to the question, what could be done to improve the use of EU sources. And what we are advocating and lobbying for at the moment during the negotiations of the next MFF is that, and I agree with Ivan, that the Commission perhaps shouldn't open a fight against the national government, the Hungarian government, because very often it pays off for the Hungarian government. But instead of that, just looking for partners under the national member state governmental level. And instead of fighting with the Hungarian government, cooperate with the local level, with the municipalities, with the local governments, and allocate European sources to them. So sometimes it's much more effective. If it's directly managed by the Commission, then they can control it much better than the national authorities do. And as a side effect, it helps to survive opposition municipalities, and it really gives the hope for the people in those countries, in Poland and Hungary. And we have a very good cooperation with the Visegrad capital cities, Warsaw, Prague, and Bratislava, to lobby for those direct EU funding for cities, because I think that must be part of the solution.
Okay, so we've got some solutions coming through, and I know that we've also got another question which was lined up about looking at how do you support those with civil society. How can we ensure the least powerful remain active citizens? I would like to take that question forward, I think, within the EGP, but also to remind people that there are other ways of contacting people, even though it's a virtual conference. Use the facilities on the sort of the starter page for it. But because it's a virtual conference, we can't do our usual round of applause for our excellent speakers who I think have given us some real food for thought and some information and some inspiration this afternoon. So on behalf of everybody else, thank you very much indeed. That's been, I don't really mind about it. If everybody else has enjoyed it as much as I have, then that's brilliant. Thank you. That a reminder that the first full plenary session starts in 20 minutes, and because it's a virtual conference, you have to get your own coffee, not stand in the queues. But that has also got some really inspirational speakers at it. So please stay on, join that, use the facilities that do exist on this particular sort of platform to contact other people to see what you might want to take forward. The European Green Party itself has got 2 or 3 European ideas labs that we're working on to exchange information, but there are particular issues that maybe as well that we can either take up as our own future webinars, or if some of you as parties are inspired to sort of try and get something going on that and want to advertise it around, also let us know. So thank you again to our brilliant speakers. Thank you also to the staff that have been working in the background on this to make it happen, and also to the very many people that have come and that have stayed. And that, I think, is a real also sort of signal of how much they've appreciated your input this afternoon. Thank you all very much indeed. And over to the main session. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.